Hey guys, today we're talking about how to sound less robotic when scratching. I'm also going to break down the awesome whip tear stroke bumpy knuckles combo at the end, so stick around for that. My friend YBC sent me this clip of himself cutting, and we got onto the topic of how to sound less robotic when scratching. This got me thinking, so I decided to look up the definition of robotic, and I found this. Something is robotic if it moves or behaves like a machine. If you express no emotion and do things in an automatic seeming way, your friends might say you're robotic. So that's probably not something that we'd want to associate with our own scratching. So I tried to think of some things that we could do to kind of get out of that potential pitfall. So here's a few tips on how I've been dealing with this. I guess I'll also say that if you're not as good as young Chris yet, maybe skip this tutorial and come back once you've got your basics a bit more down. Swing your cuts. So what is swing? Think about drummers. They can either drum on the beat or they can be slightly before or behind the beat. I can demonstrate this better actually by just getting a quick break in Ableton, and let's warp it around and I'll show you what I mean. So in visual terms, you might think about it like this versus this. To do this, when you're counting in your head, if you count something more like 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4, you just put a bit of bop into it basically, and it'll just sort of manifest itself into your scratching and just sort of feel that kind of like a little bit, yeah, it's swung. It's just a bit kind of off kilter, and I think it's cool. The next tip is getting off the grid. And I think this is a pretty big one when we're talking about sounding robotic. A common pitfall is to start our scratches on the 1 and then finish on the 4. So kind of like, and after a while it can sound a little bit obvious and predictable, and there's a million different ways to essentially get off the grid, but here's a few that you can try today. One of the more simple ways might be to just delay your scratches by an 8th note. Try just chucking in a quick baby before you start your normal phrase. It does make a really big difference. It's surprising. Another way to get off the grid is to transition into your scratches at different points. You might start backwards, for instance. You could also do the same combo, but start it maybe like 2/3 of the way through the scratch. This is called rotating scratches. I think the most natural and probably most important way to get off the grid is to be able to transition between different scratches well. If you can flow between open and closed faded cuts seamlessly, for instance, you can just keep scratching and you'll naturally fall off the grid. Certain patterns are made up of 6 notes and some are made up of 8 notes, and if you just combo these together, eventually you're going to fall off the grid. We obviously don't really have rhymes per se in scratching, but we can imagine we do. Say we go back to my example earlier where you release the record at the end of every phrase. That becomes your rhyme. Now, if we rhyme at the end of our phrase every single time like this, we start to sound a little bit like Nice and Smooth when they're rapping. We don't want to sound like Nice and Smooth when we're rapping. We want to sound like MF Doom. Doom is famous for placing tons of rhymes all the way through his sentences and all the way in the verse, so we can play around with doing that ourselves. Basically make anything into a rhyme. You could just do a drag every single time and repeat that, and that becomes a motif in its own, and that's what your rhyme becomes. So guys, if you didn't already know, my goal this year is to hit 10k subs. So I'd really appreciate it if you'd help me out and like this video, comment, share it with all the people who you think might like it, all that good stuff. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you very much. My next tip is don't be afraid of making mistakes. If you don't quite do what you wanted to do, just do it again. And now you can make this your motif, and everyone thinks you're a boss and is wondering what the hell that crazy scratch you just did is. I honestly can't really demo this too easily because if I did, well, you just wouldn't even know that I'd done it, I suppose. Instead, here's a few clips of people styling things out. I think that kind of shows what I'm talking about fairly well. I always seem to harp on about record control in every single video, but I think that's probably because it's the most important thing. And I can go and tell you to go and practice your record control as much as I want, but it's not necessarily going to help you in your next practice session. So I'm going to give you a couple of things which I found worked for me to help me sound less robotic. Turning off the motor. If you do this when you're scratching, it forces you to use your hands to make every single sound. It makes everything you do deliberate and you're not relying on the motor for any kind of help. It's just something that you should try, and it's a good drill. And yeah, turn the platter off every now and again and see what cool things you can come up with. The next tip I want to talk about is basically getting your fingers and letting them bend in this way. Not everyone's fingers bend like that naturally. If you look at someone like D-Styles, his fingers are bent in this direction so much. I didn't really notice this until I started learning whip tears, but for whip tears to work, your finger has to be in this bent position. Once I started to get these cuts down and started doing this more naturally, I'd really noticed a curious thing, and that was that my scratching almost sounded like someone else was doing it. You're essentially letting your fingers do the talking by allowing them to bend in this way. They kind of turn into springs, I suppose, and you get a little bit of extra definition to your cuts. If your fingers don't bend well this way naturally, like mine don't really, I guess you can do a bit of yoga like this to get them going that way a bit more, and after a while your fingers will start to get used to it and you can start to do this yourself. So as promised, here's my quick explanation of whip tears or bumpy knuckles. They're great because they take tears, which are traditionally two movements, and they combine it into a more efficient, just single motion. You can drill it and keep doing them, and after a while, you can just throw them in unconsciously, and that allows you to combine them with other scratches much easier because you have less to think about. They're also a bit loosey-goosey by nature, which is why I really like them, I think, because they help me sound slightly less robotic. So you basically keep your hand flat, and as you're pulling back, you bump your knuckles into the air and then back down again, all in one movement. Your hand needs to start in a flat position. This small movement, when done correctly, causes a tear at the tip of your fingers. It probably won't be as defined as a normal tear, and it's a bit quicker, but that's really our goal here. It can also help to use your thumb to sort of help with the movement. So if you go bop like that with your thumb, and I don't know, for whatever reason, doing that with your thumb seems to help. But don't forget to come back down after you've gone up, because you can go like that, but you've got to come down to make the whole tear sound. Once you have them down, you can literally combine them with all the other cuts, chirp flares, autobahns, two clickers, anything essentially. And that's why it's really cool, because it's just like you start to unlock all these new patterns which you didn't know before. Probably do another more in-depth tutorial on these because this was a bit quick. So depending on when you watch this, it may or may not be up here or in the description. I've also got another more cerebral video planned on animation curves versus scratching. If you're interested, click that here. If those videos aren't there yet, stay tuned, they're on their way. Peas and carrots, y'all.